Hello everybody. Think we should all be live and running now. Hopefully you can see me okay and hear me okay.
Hello everybody.
Just get our little bits of housekeeping out of the way, make sure everything's working all right. Okay. Thanks, Renee. Thanks, Tammy. Good to see you both. I'm assuming that everything is working okay and we can crack straight on. Well, I've left my palette up there in the window. Look, I can turn this off. Not that it makes an awful lot of difference because there's nothing very important there. Okay, let's get going. So today is, I'm going to show you what I think is probably one of the most important exercises in my painting career. Seriously, the bit where suddenly I started to understand how to create form, three-dimensional form and depth on a two-dimensional surface on the panel. So I'm going to take you through this exercise, and I'm going to, if you've done my colour course, you would have seen this exercise before, but you would have seen it done with Munsell. I am using neutrals to do it today, Munsell neutrals, but you don't have to do it that way, and I'm going to show you a way to do it even if you don't have any of the Munsell stuff, which will work just as well. So let me go. Yes, there's roughly a 10-second delay between me actually saying something and you seeing and hearing it, except for the chat. When I type something into the chat, that's instant, there's no delay. So it means the chat is sometimes slightly out of sync with the actual, with the video, you know, what I'm doing. So just to show you, here is the setup for today. I think I'll bring the exposure up on that camera just a little bit. Let's have a look, where are we? Camera 5. Not too much. So what I'm basically going to attempt to do is to replicate pretty much what I see here, over here, in terms of the overall value balance. I think actually I'm gonna move this slightly forward so that I get just a little bit here so I can see that there's a cast shadow there. I've left the background black to really simplify it. So what let me show you the palette quickly as well. What I'm going to use here is I have some pre-mixed paints here, just a straight value scale. Okay, now these are Munsell neutrals, but they don't have to be. So these basically correspond to either end of the scale. I've got titanium white here, and I've got ivory black here. Okay, now this is value 1, which corresponds to the Munsell scale here. This is value 3, which corresponds there. This is 5, which is there. This is 7, which is there, and this is 9, which is there. Now I only have every second one because I find you don't really need more than that. And in practice, I think you could actually get away with even less than that because you can mix between them. The other thing you're going to need to do this exercise is a small piece of paper. So you see mine is well used. Grey is best, with a small hole cut out of the middle of it, which we're going to use to judge the values. The palette knife. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be mixing colours and checking them in the palette knife, okay? So let's go straight in. So the first thing I want to do, I'll describe each stage as I'm doing it. I'm going to get some paint on a brush, and I'm going to, this is just a hog filbert, and I'm going to wipe most of it off. You'll have seen me do this before, so that it becomes like, for the drawing out stage, sorry, it becomes pretty much like charcoal. So the first thing I'll do is I'll fix a registration point. So as usual, the angle of the camera is slightly different than my angle of view. So for me, this mark here matches up exactly with this line here. It won't be quite the same for you, of course. So the top of the sphere is about here. The bottom of the sphere is about there. So if I put a line down the middle, you don't really have to spend an awful lot of time on drawing out for stuff like this. You don't want it to be crazy. You know, you want it to be a circle. I take that line over, and that's the top of the sphere. Take that line over, and that's the bottom of the sphere. This mark I won't actually use, it's just to make sure I get my head back into roughly the same position every time. And if I mark the point between them, then I'm going to want a horizontal as well. And I can measure this distance and just replicate it out here. And then this, obviously, the other side is going to be the same. I say it doesn't, I wouldn't get too hung up about it being perfect, but if your drawing is really out, I mean, really creating form is kind of, it's a combination of good drawing, good values, and what I'm about to show you, which will relate to the paint application one from May, which I've just uploaded and is in the threads dashboard now. So I'll put the diagonals in. Again, they don't have to be perfect, they just need to be reasonable. Take that measurement and take it round about there. I usually take the same measurement each time for my comparison, because otherwise you find that if you take a different one each time, small errors can easily get replicated very quickly. You can see you can rough out a sphere quickly this way, but if you have trouble with this, just use a pair of compasses and draw it out. No reason why you shouldn't do that. The main point of this exercise is to learn how to create form with value and paint application, and I'm going to be stressing very much as I paint through this the modeling factors, and I'll talk about them as I deal with them. Nice, easy and quick way to rough out a sphere. Not perfect, you know, but it's close enough for what we need. Now the cast shadow, I always draw those in. I think it's very useful to do. It's going to come back like this. This you just need to do it by eye. And I could stop there for my drawing out, but what I'm going to stress here, that the secret to form, to creating form, is thinking in two terms, in light and shadow. So you see how all of this is the light side. Here is the division between the light and the shadow. All of this is the light side, all of this is the dark side. So I'm going to put that in. And you notice how it becomes much less clear down here, where the division is. It's clearest up here, less clear here. And that's because there's light coming down and bouncing here on the surface in front of the sphere and bouncing up into the shadow. Those little things are very important to notice. So I've just divided it into light and shadow. Nice and simple. Now in terms of the modeling factors, I use 5. A lot of the time when I'm painting these days, doing actual paintings, I think just in binary terms, light and shadow, and I mix a colour for each area of the painting, the background for each object, whatever it is I'm painting. I mix a light and a shadow colour. If there's more than one local colour, like a pear or like flowers, then I'll mix a few light and shadow colours and mix between them. The reason we're only doing this with values is because it simplifies the whole job. We don't have to deal with colour. This makes it much easier, and you can create the most incredible sense of depth and form, like this. Oh, the sun's coming out a little bit. I hadn't realised it had got so far around the sky. This is because my windows are north-northwest facing, and apparently we're getting round to the part of the year where the sun will come in a little bit. But it actually, interestingly, it won't change. It changes the look on the camera quite a bit because the exposure is blown out a bit now. But it actually doesn't change the values that you see that much. I know it's hard to believe. I'll bring the exposure of this one down a little bit. Oh, I'm on the wrong camera. That was the palette. Let's bring it down a little bit, make it clearer to see now. I'm probably going to have to bring it up and down a little bit as we go. I might have a bit of a problem around here. I might have to bring the blind down a little bit. Wasn't really expecting this to happen today. But never mind, it won't affect the exercise, at least anyway, too much. So light and shadow, the 5 modeling factors. So here, you could say there are 2, and one of them is the cast shadow, okay? Now within the shadow side, you divide this into 2, and as I was saying, that's this bit which we call the core shadow, where there's some reflected light from around the room, but there's no direct light. And then here, this is the reflected light, where light is bouncing down here and bouncing back in there. If there was an object here, then there would be some light bouncing onto it and bouncing back into the shadow, so that would be reflected light too. So I would divide it about somewhere like there, I would say, is the end of the core shadow, so I'd just roughly mark that in. So now I've got 3 different areas plus the cast shadow. So in the light, there's an area which we would generally call the half tone, which is, it's very difficult to say exactly where it is, and where it stops and where it starts, especially on a very gradual form, like gradually changing form like this. It's almost impossible to see clearly. But we know that there's an area just around here between the light part and the shadow part, but it belongs to the light. It doesn't belong to the shadow. So you need to be very careful when you put this half tone in to be able to notice this clear separation. And you can see it here between the shadow and the light. That's it there, the terminator. The bedbug line, people call it. This is kind of the half tone. So we'll roughly bring that in as the half tone area. So now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And the cast shadow, I'm going to add 1 more, and that's the highlight. And that's this bit here, the bit where there's direct light, bounce light coming down onto the sphere and then out to your eye. And we'll put that around here. And those are the modeling factors. Core shadow. I've got a PDF which I'll add when I put the upload of this in. Core shadow, reflected light, half tone, light, highlight. And then we've got our cast shadow here, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do now, just let me know if that makes sense to you, or you can pop a little message in the chat if that seems to make sense. Now, if you remember from the paint application one, I generally start with the background first. So let's pop back to the palette. And I'll get usually a biggish hog, and the background is black, so I'm going to go with ivory black. I generally don't use any medium if I'm doing alla prima or if I'm painting the first stage of a painting. I don't need a huge amount of paint on there, but I do need to cover that background as well as I can. I'm just going to scrub it in. So we've got this, the sun is kind of coming out and going away again, which is a little bit frustrating. But this is all background shadow, and then this is the core shadow here. That's the cast shadow, sorry, there. So I'll just scrub that in up to the edge. I don't want a hard edge, and I'm putting it on pretty thin. And that makes a big difference, I think, with backgrounds, is you don't want, it's not a rule. I mean, you know, people do paint thickly in their backgrounds and it can work. But if you're looking to create a sense of depth and form, then a thinly painted background will help you do that best. So I'm using a fair amount of pressure, and I'm kind of scrubbing this on. We'll have to see what happens with the light. Hopefully it's going to drop a little bit. It's blowing out the subject a little bit, but it won't. It shouldn't blow out what we've got here. And what you'll be able to do if you want to have a go at this exercise is take the values that you see me use. It'll be very easy if you've got the Munsell set, but the Munsell book, but you'll still be able to do it if you haven't. Is draw this out, this study, take the values that you see me use and paint the study yourself. And I think you'll find that a really interesting one. And I'll show you roughly where each value is on a scale that you can easily make yourself if you don't have the Munsell book. Okay, so that's the background in, nice and simple. The next value I want really is, I want this general value of the foreground around here. The best way to get that is to judge what you think it might be. So if I go back over to the palette, I've got sunlight shining across the palette now as well. The weather really isn't behaving. It's been overcast all day and this looked perfect when I set it up. I may have to make some changes to the values because the sun is getting quite strong now. Let me just check the exposure of the camera. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad. We'll go on. We'll go on and we'll see how we go. It's just because cameras deal with these kind of changes in light a lot less well than our eyes do. So it does mean that it's blowing out a little bit. I wonder what would happen if I dropped the blind a little bit. See if that will affect. Still get enough light coming in to work whilst not having direct sunlight on anything. It might, I think it's probably going to drop the light too much. Sorry, I'm having to do a bit of gymnastics here to reach the blind over the laptop. Sorry about that. There's still, yeah, that's going to be better. There's still light on the palette. I think probably the sun will move around as I work and the palette will become easy to see after a little while. It's just blowing out a little bit because we've got some direct sunlight. But if I drop it low enough so that the whole palette is in shadow, then there's not enough light on the subject, unfortunately. Sorry, there's always a little bit of messing about to do when the light isn't behaving. Okay, so let's get back to this. Judging the value, I'll start with my palette knife, and I'm going to judge it as being, let me switch back and make sure, I'll show you what I'm going to judge, and hopefully it will it would be a bit better setup. Yeah, so we've cut out the extra light now. You can, incidentally, you can see here that this value that I've got here isn't quite as low as that, and it never really will be, because this area here, it has no light on it at all. It's not reflecting any light, hardly any. We can't get quite that low with black paint, so this is about as low as I can get. So to an extent, you need to work with what you have available in your paints. So I'm looking for a value that's like that, and if I hold this up at the same angle to the light as my easel and hold it there, over here you can see it's slightly lighter. This area here is slightly lighter than the surface of the color checker, and this over here is about the same. So I can actually hit that fairly accurately. If I go back to my palette, inevitably there'll be some adjustment to be done as well. But if I go back to the palette, I can see my value 5 there is fairly close. It's probably slightly lighter. Let's put a little bit out flat so I can see it. You see, that's pretty close in value. So what I'd be inclined to do is to get another brush. Again, still working with fairly big ones at this point. Get some of this value here. Get a bit more of this out, because I'm basically I'm painting in the light now. Hello, kitten. Studio cat is wanting some attention. Sorry, little fella, I'm a little bit busy. So over here, this was about right. This was about the same value as I was seeing when I was looking through the little color checker. So I'll just block that in. Generally, we'll do that a bit thicker. Paint with more texture and brush strokes. Doesn't need to be perfect, because I'm dealing with the light. So anytime I'm dealing with the light, I start to think about applying thicker paint. Back here, behind the cast shadow, before we get into the full shadow, I can see a bit more of the background, but the value is slightly lower. So I'll put that in. Let me bring up the palette on an insert to you can see what I'm doing on the palette at the same time. I know, kitten. He's trying to climb up my leg. Please don't do that. I know. Now I'm going to soften this edge just by doing a little bit of hatching and then drag across, because it's very subtle, that back there. And you would have seen me do that also in the paint application one that I've just uploaded the edited videos for. Softening edges by hatching and dragging works really well. So over the other side, I want it to be slightly lighter, so I'm going to bring a little bit of the next value up, but not too much. Over this side of the painting is slightly lighter. It's the kind of thing that's what color checkers are useful for. It doesn't mean you have to work absolutely to absolute values, but it shows you small differences that it would be difficult to see otherwise, that your eye would basically fool you into missing. Some nice thick juicy painting there, because I'm painting the light. I really strongly encourage you to give this one a go, even if all you do is do a copy of what I'm working on here as close as you can with the values, because it's hard to see This needs to be softened, so I'm putting a value in between in there. It's hard to see the difference on a camera. It's hard to pick up the difference between the thin paint here and the thicker paint here. I'm going to put another bit of intermediate value there, just to help me when I hatch this and smooth it out. And then I'll do my hatching. Now, a clever little trick for hatching. You know, with cast shadows, they tend to be sharpest nearest the area, the object that catches them, and softer as they go away. And you can emulate that really easy by doing small hatches and then doing gradually bigger hatches and then drag. It's such an effective and easy way to soften edges. One thing I will say about this technique though, you need to make sure that you have enough paint on the panel or your painting surface, whatever you're using, to do that and for it to work. Because when you drag, you lift some paint off. I'm just going to sharpen this bit, this side again a little bit. You lift some paint off, and eventually you'll get down to the panel and it won't look so good. Almost everyone that I've seen on the workshops, the 2 workshops that I've taught, didn't use enough paint and needed to be encouraged to get more paint out. Now this shadow here is not quite as dark as this, it's slightly lighter. So I'm going to go, this is my palette, this is black, this is value 1. I'm going to go somewhere between 1 and 3, which will give me about a value 2 in Munsell terms. But you can also, if you have a simple value string like this set up, you can mix it yourself. You don't need Munsell to do this. Just have a look at where I am on the value scale here from light to dark. And you'll be able to do the same thing. Now I always paint the cast shadow in next. And the reason I do that, I do this when I'm painting usually as well, doing a painting. The reason I do that is it means that I can pretty much get the cast shadow done without worrying about messing anything up around here. So if I get the cast shadow right, then I can paint the sphere over the cast shadow, and it will be a really effective way for me to create this kind of visual depth. So we're dealing with the values. Ow, please cat, don't do that. We're dealing with the modeling factors, but we're also dealing with application of the paint, and all these things working together in harmony are going to create this impression that we want. I'm going to hatch this now, and as I did it before, it's going to be, the shadow will be sharper here and softer there. Let me bring in a bit more of that, the background here, because it's wandered a little there. A bit dark. The drawing has wandered a bit, I mean. All right, that's okay. So the shadow will be sharper here and softer there, so bigger hatches here, going down to smaller ones as we get closer. Wipe the brush off and then drag. You see how that softens the shadow more the further you move away? Really simple technique, but it works brilliantly for blending. As long as you have enough paint on there. And I always think with studies like this, at this stage, you should start to have already something of a feeling of light and shadow, even though we've done very, very little painting. We already have a kind of an impression here. I'm just sharpening up the shadow here and sorting out the drawing a bit. An impression here of light. Just because the values are working, just with values, edges, and the paint application. You could absolutely do it with an orange, but it's much more complicated if you're using colour as well, because if you get your colours slightly out, then it won't work as well. I would strongly suggest doing it with what I have here is, this is a polystyrene ball. It's about 4 inches high, 4 inches in diameter. You can get them from most craft shops. Give it a coat of acrylic primer and then paint over it a light mid value with oil paint, and then it's ready to paint. Okay, so let me just knock the palette out for a second. And I'm going to show you, the next thing I want to do is I'm gradually moving from shadow towards the light now. So I'm going to paint this shadow area here, but I want to get that value pretty much right. And if I hold this over there, I can see this is really useful because your eye will always trick you about this. You see how it's actually darker? This area here I'm looking for, the core shadow. It's darker than the surface of the color checker, right? Not by much, but a little bit. So it's darker than all of this. So painting by, I don't need to nail it exactly, but I want to be pretty close. I'm going to paint fairly thinly for the shadow part, because again it's thin shadow, thick light. And put out a bit more of the middle value. You can see I've got these tubed up ready, but you don't have to do this. Remind me if I forget, but what I'm going to do at the end is very quickly show you how to knock out a value scale that's a bit like this, very, very quickly, like in minutes, but with titanium white and ivory black. It will be cooler overall, but it will work fine. Oh. The sun's dropping down the sky, and it's. I'm going to have to drop the blind down a little bit further. I hadn't realised we were so far through the year. Obviously, what I'm going to have to start doing is, if I do any in the evening now, I'm going to have to go back to doing them with light, with artificial light. So this value I know is slightly darker than this. That's about the middle value. The value I use for the foreground, so I'll bring a little bit of the next value down into it, and that looks about the right relationship to me. On the colour course, and when I teach colour on the workshops, I do this really, really strictly. This I'm doing a little more loosely. It needs to be, in relationship terms, darker than this and lighter than that. That's feeling a little bit too dark to me, so I'm going to lighten it a little. I'd say we're somewhere like that. Core shadow. Then slightly lighter still for the reflected light. It's very, very easy. You need to be careful with this. It's very, very easy to overdo reflected light. But you can see here, these values are almost the same. And if I hold the color checker up in front of them, it's also a good way to isolate them and see the difference. So the color checker is useful for seeing absolute values, but it's also very useful for checking relationships. Didn't paint that very carefully. I've got a bit of a blob on the edge of my sphere. Now here, because I've got a shadow meeting shadow edge, I'll hatch that to soften it. And then wipe off. And soften that edge like that. Oh, the sun's really come out now. Ordinarily I'd be thinking, what a beautiful evening, I can sit in the garden and have a little glass of wine, but at the moment it's driving me crazy with the cameras. There you go, hopefully that's a bit clearer. So what I'm going to do next is I'll do the half tone. Now I know in order to judge that, I'm going to have a look at the value of the light. Now this is this bit over here. So I can hold that up there and get a good idea of the relationship of that to my color checker, and the halftone is somewhere around here. And that looks about the same, roughly. It's a very gradual change. You can see how gradual it is, but it's about the same value as the color checker. And this is the light over here, is a little bit lighter. So I know that I want something around the value of the color checker, so I can put in the halftone. Now I'm into the light now. So thicker paint should be slightly lighter than the core shadow. You can't see this too clearly because it's such a gradual change. But conceptually, there's an area there which is just slightly lighter. Will be about the same as the reflected light. Now, what's worrying me now about this is I'm kind of doing okay, but the separation between my light and my shadow isn't very clear. So at that point, I'm really going to need that. It's really important that you keep that separation. So I'm going to darken the core shadow slightly because I'm balancing the relationships and I need this to be darker. Otherwise, it's not going to work as core shadow. Perhaps even a little bit more than that. Needs to be lighter than the background. That's probably about right, but it needs to be lighter than the background, but darker than the halftone. And then I've got the light area, which is this bit here, which I know is lighter than this. Quite a bit lighter than that. I'm going to get a fresh brush out for that. So this is like moving up the value scale. Not all the way up to white yet, but I need to make sure that here is the color that I used for the halftone. I need to make sure that I have a clear distinction there, and also that I have plenty of paint out. Because I'm going to paint this thick. Let's go overboard with this. There's my value 7. Just to show you how you can really create depth with paint. That's quite a bit lighter than what I have there. My color checker, can you see that? This paint is thick. Very thick indeed. Sorry, just a quick bit more. Adjustment of the cameras. Okay, here we go now. I'm going to leave this bit here because that's my highlight. Remember this little bit in the middle here. But I'm going to paint the rest really thickly. I'm troweling it on. Absolutely troweling it on. And I'll put it all on before I do any of the blending that I'm going to want to do later. And you can hopefully, even before you've done the blending, if you've done a pretty good job with the relationships and everything is pretty much in the right place, you'll already start to be creating a feeling of form. So this is the full light. If you want to be more detailed with this, you can paint like you can divide this full light area here into two as well, into the lightest light and the light and the dark light, people call it. It's still, even the dark light is still lighter than the halftone, but you tend to find that there's an area closest to the light, which I could show with this, put in some of this value, which will be slightly lighter. Again, I'm literally troweling this paint on. I'm not being at all careful. It's almost like I'm sculpting this sphere out of paint. Okay. Hopefully you can see the kind of texture I'm getting there. And then I'm going to want to hatch, because these are very smooth transitions here, so I'll hatch that. And because I want this one kind of extra smooth, I'll get a dry sable brush. and smooth that carefully. You don't need to go to town for this. You don't have to spend a huge amount on it, huge amount of time on it. Then I'm going to get a darker brush up, and I'm going to hatch just a little, just very subtly, between the half tone and the core shadow. The reason I'm doing that subtly is because I really need to make sure that I don't lose that separation of light to shadow. I need this to be standing out clearly from that, and I can soften that transition easily as well down into the reflected light. So I'm starting to get something of a sphere. I think I need a slightly dark light area there. I guess in a way I'm bringing the half-tone value further over. But you don't need to spend too long on that. And I'm not hatching that at all. I'm leaving it really roughly painted because I think it actually helps. This transition here, I want to soften quite a bit more. Wipe off my dry brush and just, because I've got so much paint here, I can literally, if I want this to be lighter, I can just drag across there and it'll pull some of the paint in. Can you see that happening? And I can create my reflected light that way. Now directly underneath, in the core shadow here, is what we call, in the cast shadow is what we call the occlusion, which is an area of no light at all. So you use your darkest value there, which is black. My drawing is a little bit out there, and then I'll give that a quick stroke. Not too much because I don't want to lose the value. I need to sort out a bit of the drawing there as well. It's not very sphere-like, that bit. Got a bit lumpy. And you can finesse it quite a long way beyond this point if you want to. I'm also going to soften this. So I've got shadow into shadow, so I don't want a hard edge there. I want a soft edge. So by the time I'm done with the edges, the only hard edge I've really got is this one here. In the light. And you can make that as hard as you like. It's always going to help. You know, create this sense of form. The paint is very, very thick here. Very thick indeed. So the last thing I need to paint is this. And I'll use titanium white, but I'm going to drag across it because it won't actually be completely white. So if you have good relationships, you can be really quite rough about how you paint these things and they will still work, you know. With comparatively little effort, really, I've made a fairly convincing sphere. Other little things you might want to do, there's usually a slightly lighter bit of the foreground here because there'll be some light hitting there and then coming down here. So you can put that in. It's very subtle, but it can help a little bit with the depth, you know. Let me bring the exposure of that. The sun's gone back in again, which is kind of nice, because now we can see hopefully a little bit more clearly. That camera's getting a bit dark now. And we're back in terms of value to pretty much where we started. So my sphere looks like someone's actually sat on it and squished it down. But hopefully you can see that what I'm creating there is a kind of pretty much an impression, an impression of light and depth, you know. If I wanted to go even further than this, and there's no reason why you shouldn't. Sorry, let me just, I just realized I get into painting these studies and I wasn't really watching the comments enough. Let me have a quick look. Was that the outrageously useful thing, the shadow hatching? No, the shadow hatching is the edge hatching for edges is outrageously useful. As long as you've got enough paint on the surface, it works really, really well. The outrageously useful thing is this exercise, because it will teach you to separate the modeling factors. So although I've done quite a bit of blending here, you saw me put each one on separately. I'll just switch back to that camera to show you it again. We've got the core shadow, the reflected light, the half tone, and the light and the highlight, and then we've got the cast shadow here and the occlusion shadow. Now, all of these things have kind of blended a little bit more into one. My sphere is a fair bit lighter than this one, but it's still working fairly well as a sphere. I would probably, if I was going to be strict about this one, I would bring all of this value down so it was closer to what I can see here. But even though I've kind of separated this out into conceptual areas when I painted it, it's still working pretty well as a three-dimensional form, as a sphere. And that's the really useful thing, because any object that you paint, if you can internalize these modeling factors, any object that you paint, especially in natural light, will have a combination of these factors. All of those 5 modeling factors on the form, plus the cast shadow and the occlusion shadow, will be there on anything: a piece of fruit, a flower, a jug. They will show themselves slightly differently depending on the surface of the object and the light that's falling on it, but they will always be there. And if you can look for those 5 modeling factors when you paint something, and you can think in those terms, you will get much closer to a convincing, believable depth and life in your paintings. It's not just getting the values right, although that's a huge part of it, and the drawing. It's also about how you handle the edges and how you apply the paint. If I wanted to, at this point, I could go, for sake of fun, because I know that I've got something reasonably convincing here, I can play with it now. This, I think, could be darker, so I'm going to darken the light a little bit, just because I think it will get it closer to what I'm seeing. The value changes can be fairly subtle sometimes. Now, if I wanted to, because I've already got a fairly good impression of form here, there's stuff that I can do with this if I wanted to start dissolving parts of it, do a bit more creative stuff with it. You know, you can really start to play. As long as you've got this kind of, this feeling first, you know, I can really soften this back edge. All I'm doing there is just, because I've got enough paint on here, I can just pull it around, you know, and you see how this is kind of disappearing off into a kind of a haze of mysterious shadow back here, you know. I can do a little bit round here as well if I want to. You know those effects that you often see people do when they do a little glow on things, and it kind of, I love these kind of effects. Sometimes I don't paint with them at all, and sometimes I paint with them quite a lot. It can really, really help. This bit back here, I can completely have this fuzzing out to nothing, you know, if I want to. Which will, all this stuff, I think it kind of, it helps to, let's soften this right off. You know, you can get really creative with what you do with the paint there, and it's starting to take on a kind of a shimmer now, you know. A shimmer in an atmosphere that this form is kind of developing out of. You can only do this if you've got enough paint on the surface, though. You know, that's just a quick bit of messing about to show you the kind of things you can do. If you want to take this like a little bit further, than it being kind of what you might call an accurate representation of what's there. If you do this with fruit and stuff, it looks wonderful, as long as you've nailed your modelling factors first. If you haven't nailed your modelling factors first, you tend to find that it looks like it looks forced, it looks deliberate, and it doesn't work. It doesn't help the painting at all. But if you've nailed the modelling factors and you've your edges are good, and if you've if your edges are good and you've nailed your modelling factors and your values are good, then frankly, you can get away with murder. If they're not good, you can't. You can't get away with anything. So now I've done that, I'm just, I've pulled the painting around. I'm just adding some stuff to kind of to pull it back. I'm playing with it now. Really, I'm just playing with it. Let's have one hard edge bit there just to show that that's really standing out. Really, edge handling is such a huge part of painting form. I'm surprised that people don't talk about it more. Am I on the wrong? I'm on the wrong camera. Sorry. So what I did there was I added a bit more occlusion shadow back in, and then all of this had gone soft, and I just hardened that little bit there. Let's let this go right off into shadow, into vagueness. Let's create something here. See, all of this is developing. You got to be. There'll be a point where I pull this so far that it will cease working as a study. You've got to be careful how much you do this. But it is surprising, if you've set things up well, how much freedom you can have about what you do with it, as long as you have a strong foundation first. Does that make sense? Now, what I would advise you to do is first, I was going to show you the value scale thing. Let me bring you the palette up full size. Better bring the exposure up a little bit as well, because the sun's gone back in now and the light's dropping. Where are we? Camera 6. Okay. Creating a planet with atmosphere, yeah. If you want to make a really, really quick value scale that works almost exactly the same as a Munsell scale, as long as you apply it consistently across your painting, it will work. And all you need is ivory black and titanium white. Okay, so here's my white. Here's my black. Maybe we need a little bit more of that. So the first thing to do is to make a value somewhere between the two. You just judge this by eye, okay? Make sure I'm going to need a bit more white, I think, as well, probably, for this, to demonstrate this usefully enough. You will find yourself using more white than black. Now these, if you use this titanium white and ivory black, they're both slightly blue, so it will be cooler, but it doesn't make any difference. You can work with it just as well. So what you're looking for with this mix is something that you feel is perceptually in between these two. And I think that's pretty close in between the two. So I'll bung that there. And then I want something between these two. So I'll get some white. Some of this. You don't have to spend forever on this. You're looking for something that you feel is perceptually in between those two. I would say that's probably closer to that, so I'll add more white. Bring the value up. Titanium is better for this because lead white is not as strong in mixes. You get there quicker with this. Somewhere between the two. Then I want somewhere between these two. Get some of that. Some black. Now this is just titanium white and ivory black, remember? And that's pretty good, I would say. It's probably somewhere between the two. So that there you have a really simple value scale that you can use for this exercise. You've basically got 3 middle values and white and black. It's a 5 value value scale, and you can paint with it, and it works a treat. If you want to, you can do in between those two, and in between those two, and in between those two, and in between those two. You know, so you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, a 9 value scale, and that will work really well as well. But this is fine. That's all you need for painting with. And you will be able to create something that looks very like that. Oh, the light. I'm going to have to remember this for next time. The light is really all over the place. It's coming around to that time of year. So hopefully that's been useful to you. Now, I would encourage you don't just watch this exercise, do it. Get a panel. Even if you don't have the subject, try and copy what I've done here. Look at the values, mix yourself up a value scale, and look at the values on the study that I've done here and try and replicate them. And think about those 5 modeling factors as you do it. The best way to do this exercise is to get a few of these spheres and to paint some darker values, middle values, and lighter values, especially one black and one white as well. And then do paintings of them individually. And if you have the patience, get 2 or 3 and do paintings of them together. It will teach you a huge amount about value. And every time, as you do it, think about your modeling factors and think about how you're applying the paint. Thin in the shadows, thick in the lights, and judiciously soften, blend the edges where you need them to be soft. Generally speaking, soft edges work better than hard to create an illusion of depth. To the extent that I would say a good approach for this is to paint all the edges soft and then selectively harden ones at the end where you have a light against a shadow, and only there. René, yeah, I hope you do have fun. It is actually really good fun. And once you've got the thing up there, don't be precious about it. Get a fan brush or anything and pull it around, you know. See what happens when you do. This is really good for you to just experiment with and to see how far you can take it. I'm going to do, as we go through, I'm going to do some more exercises like this for you to try. I'm going to go deep into values fairly soon because values is superbly important in painting. And I'm going to do some really in-depth stuff on that over the next few months. Other stuff we'll be covering as well, obviously, but expect to see a few more cubes and spheres popping up, sometimes with actual objects as well. Give you a little sneak preview. This cube here is the colours of a conference pair, the 2 local colours of a conference pair. So if you hold it up in the light, like this, you can see what happens to those colours when they're in the shadow and when they're in the light, and you can match them really well. I'll be showing you how to do that and how to absolutely nail the colours of stuff. Put all that together with being able to paint good form, and you'll be better than 99% of painters out there. Seriously. So I hope that was good and informative. I'm going to sign off now, if there aren't any more questions. Okay says, I loved your roses painting. Was it, I'm not sure which one you would mean. Would it be, I'm assuming, let me switch cameras so I can show you. I'm assuming it's that one. Yeah. This one was when I came out of my very difficult couple of weeks, a bit longer, when I felt like I could no longer paint. I seem to be rolling again now. These things just happen, it goes that way sometimes. This is the next one I did, obviously, is a bit bigger. This one I've just taken a jigsaw to it, and I took about 0.5 mil off the top, and I took about 2 centimeters off this side because the composition wasn't working as well as I wanted it to. I'm very happy with that, how it's come out now. And another little sneak preview. That one's going up for auction maybe today or tomorrow, that one. This is one I just finished of wild roses in the garden, and this is a really good case in point about creating form. All of this is fairly thinly painted, and all of the edges are very, very soft, except here. It's really thick paint there on the petals to really help them to stand out and create form. So this is what happens in your paintings when you apply this stuff here. That's where it can go. Can't stress enough the importance of edges, good values, and paint application. Thanks a lot for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do have any questions about it at any point, stick them in the threads group, or you can ask questions actually within Thinkific as well on the videos themselves. So I'll have this one up as soon as I can. I must beg your forgiveness again about how long it's taking me to churn through all the video editing to get this stuff up there. I've been very busy painting as well. But I'm starting to move at a faster pace now, so we'll get June up there soon, and then these ones will be up there very soon too. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon. Bye.